Hello and welcome to your Access Point to Washington. I'm Aisha Tanzim. Today we are going to talk about Balochistan, Pakistan's largest province by landmass but smallest by population, that's facing so much violence and unrest that some are comparing it to the eastern wing of Pakistan, the wing that broke away to become Bangladesh. Joining me is a panel of experts to talk about what are the issues in Balochistan. First of all, we'll go to Dubai, where Sardar Akhtar Mengal, the president of Balochistan National Party and a former chief minister of Balochistan, has joined us. Then we'll come back to Washington, where Christine Fair of George Washington University, who's an expert on South Asia and its multiple languages and travels to the area frequently, is joining us on Skype. And then we'll go to London, where Ali Dayan Hassan is joining us on our second Skype. He is the Pakistan Director for Human Rights Watch. And Ali, we will start with you, since a UN team was recently in Pakistan to talk about enforced disappearances, a case really important, and the team has come back and submitted its report. We've had Facebook questions about that, and we'll start with some of those Facebook questions. Let me go to our first Facebook question, which is from Aslam Sultan and Safirullah, which is, what will be the consequences of this UN report? Ali, anything that might happen?
Well, we certainly hope so at Human Rights Watch, because it is our view that enforced disappearances are a very serious and ongoing problem in Balochistan. And certainly the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances has backed up exactly what Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations have been saying for many years now, which is that disappearances remain a very serious issue in Balochistan, and any idea that disappearances ended with the end of military rule in Pakistan is simply false. Because since 2008, when civilian rule was restored, disappearances have carried on, perhaps not at the same scale, but they have carried on, and further, they remain unresolved.
Okay, thank you, Ali. And Sardar Mengal, thank you so much for joining us from Dubai. We want to ask you, you're almost in a self-imposed exile, and yet recently you went back to Pakistan, went to the Supreme Court and submitted your statement. What made you think, after so many years and so much that's gone on in your personal life and in Balochistan, that you felt that this time this could be different?
Aisha, let me explain that, first of all, that I'm not in self-exile here. Actually, I'm under treatment for so many years in Dubai, but I'm keep coming on, going to Germany for my treatment, and sometimes to Singapore. But I haven't declared myself as I'm self-exiled here. Well, what asked me to go to appear in the Supreme Court? As you know, Aisha, but first you have to understand the history of Balochistan and what's going on in Balochistan since. I'm not going back to the old days, or how they, forcibly occupied Balochistan and how many military operations we had faced since then. But the last military operation, which was started during General Musharraf, and in that so many innocent people have been killed. I won't say that only from one side, from the both sides. But when this democratic government came into power, people thought, I don't know why, that this political government will bring some relief to their, the agony. But unfortunately, during this government, as Ali says, the majority people have been picked up or abducted, or their bullet-riddled bodies were found during this government. So when Supreme Court has taken initiative about this missing person, so what we thought that we'll become a party in it, because we have lost so many people. So from our party, some people are still missing, and those bullet-riddled bodies, some of them belong to our party also. As a whole, you say we belong to Balochistan, and we claim that we are Balochistan National Party is a political party, democratic party. So that's why it made us to go into a Supreme Court and plead about this case.
Okay, and you have also submitted a 6-point plan. We'll come back to that plan, but I want to bring Christine Fair into the discussion. Christine, you've given testimony on Balochistan in front of the U.S. Congress. You've worked on this issue. As an outside observer, almost a third party, which is independent of the internal political struggle that's going on in Pakistan, how do you view as the real issue in Balochistan?
I think there are multiple real issues in Balochistan. So there are some parallels to Kashmir. For example, that some of the claims about made by separatists do stem from partition, from the different kinds of agreements that the British government had with different princely states, including the Khan of Kalat. So there is this historical issue. You always have historical issues, it seems, in South Asia. So there's nothing unique about that, but one should at least, recognize that history. It's not as if it's always been copacetic. But I think the more fundamental issues are actually a lot more tractable than the historical one. When as an outsider, when I look at Pakistan historically, you've had a very strong tendency to have a strongly centralized state, and obviously many of those decades of centralized state have been overseen by the military. And so during periods of military rule, you actually do observe that the Balochistan crisis seems to be exacerbated for a number of reasons. My husband's going to go by. Spouse.
Okay, so Christine,
so
you're mentioning
and devolution, and this is where the whole resource issue comes into play, right? So because Balochistan had such a small fraction of the population, it's historically gotten a very small amount of the budget. And then there were also issues pertaining to the sale of gas, right? So to an outsider, it seems very strange why the federal government would force Balochistan to sell its gas at a price that's lower than the market price, and certainly lower than the price that neighboring Sindh sells its gas to the government. So I think these issues are incredibly easy to solve. And to an outsider, it seems so mysterious that the government, despite all of these decades and relatively simple palliative measures, it has simply not done anything about it.
And since we don't have a government representative here, I do want to mention that we reached out to a lot of them, and some of them were not available and others did not want to come in to this show. But we do have the government's point of view here. The Interior Minister of Pakistan had a press conference last weekend, and Sardar Akhtar Mengal, this is directed towards you. He says, you're playing the blame game. He's saying Pakistan's democratic government produced a package, made serious efforts, the Hukuk-e-Balochistan package. He said that they've made efforts to bring leaders, Baloch leaders, back to the country, and that now it's foreign forces that are trying to egg the separatist movements on.
Well, Aisha, this, as Rahman Malik said, the blame game. But we've been facing this blame game from the day one. In the beginning, if you see, when the first insurgency took place, they used to blame us that the Soviet Union's involvement is there. Then afterwards, India and Iraq, so on and on. But let me clear one thing, that Baloch struggle is not for the packages and not Agaz-e-Hukuk-e-Balochistan as they call it. Baloch struggle is, that all the armed people who are in the mountains, they say they're fighting for the freedom, but Balochistan National Party, with its democratic struggle, we are struggling for the right of self-determination. And the packages they have given to the Baloch people, what relieves the common Baloch people. Balochistan, among the few regions of the world where the population is very poor.
So you're saying, let me ask you for a little more clarity. You're saying you're fighting for self-determination. Now that's a word that's also used for the Kashmiri region. So when you want self-determination, what do you want on the ballot? What do you want to vote on?
Well, I didn't say I'm fighting. I say we are struggling in a political manner and democratic manner. Well, with the ballot, we have tried also to come with them, with the point with the ballot also. In return, we got the bullets from that side, not from our side. The first bullet was fired from the Pakistani military, of the intelligence agencies. they have forced the Baluch people to go to take mountains. Even if you look at the Nawab Bukti, who was at the age of 80s, what forced him to take shelter in the mountains? It was their attitude. It was their, the attitude which has
so. But you,
could I hop in here for a
yes,
second?
please, Christine, go ahead.
In the interest of fairness, so again, as a third party, I also find a lot of disingenuousness made by various Baluch leaders, and there are a number of reasons why I say that. First of all, they want to project themselves as representing all of the people of Baluchistan. And so in some ways, the people of the province are caught between the state of Pakistan that has its priorities, and then a series of tribal leaders that have their own priorities. And we cannot take at face value that these parties represent the interests of everyone in the province, especially since we've not had a census in Pakistan since 1998. However, I have done quite a bit of survey work in Pakistan. In the 2009 survey that I did, including a 1,000-ish person sample in Baluchistan, we actually find that Pashtuns are statistically equivalent in their representation as are Baluch. And so Baluch would like to make this Baluchistan issue all about Baluch, but of course the demography of that province, like provinces everywhere in the world, are changing. And so I think we also have to be very clear-eyed about who these Baluch leaders claim to represent. And I'm convinced that when and if Pakistan finalizes the census that's way overdue, I'm sure the census is going to confirm the same numbers that I have, and that is that the Baluch are not the majority that they claim. And it's not even clear, based upon the data that we have, that they're even the largest, i.e. the plurality.
Okay, so we'll come back to that, but I want to ask a question both of Sardar Mengal, you, and Ali Dayan Hassan, you. Here's something that was written in the Nation newspaper. It was an op-ed, and I'll go to that, which says, the next questionable point, that's Sardar Mengal, they're talking about your 6 points. One of the points is about the abolition of death squads, which the agencies, according to this op-ed, deny that any such squads exist. However, one wonders as to why Sardar Akhtar Mengal could not himself unearth the existence of any such death squads involved in the killing of his own brother when he was the chief minister of the province for nearly a year and a half ago. So we'll come to that, Sardar Mengal, but before that, Ali Dayan Hassan, it also says that if there are death squads in Balochistan, then who is killing the non-Baloch? The Hazaras, the Pashtuns, the Punjabis, the Sindhis, the Urdu speakings, and now increasingly the Shias.
Well, Aisha, if I may, this is a very complex situation, and there are a couple of things. I think Christine is absolutely right that there is certainly we need a census, and the Baloch leaders, such as Sardar Mengal, represent a section of the population of Balochistan, which is the Baloch. And it is by no means certain that the Baloch enjoy a plurality in Balochistan. That said, there are other issues. What the government of Pakistan has to say about the issue really has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because the fact of the matter is that Pakistan is in a fairly messy transitional situation, and the civilian government in Pakistan actually does not exercise any meaningful control or authority over the military or the intelligence agencies, who are the people who are, as I have said before, are the principal engine of abuse in the province. So whether it is a question of disappearances or a question of targeted killings and what are referred to as kill and dump operations, I mean, Human Rights Watch is of the view that at least 350 odd bodies of Baloch nationalists have been found in the last year and a half. Now, these are all things that are being perpetrated by the military, and the civilian government is unable to control them. I think that also would explain perhaps why Sardar Mengal cannot answer meaningfully questions about his capacity to do anything when he was in power himself, because the fact is that political governments in Balochistan do not exercise political authority.
Just said
that is actually at the heart of the problem.
You've just mentioned about 350 bodies that, according to Human Rights Watch, have been found, and that we're alleging that the military is involved. I want to ask you about these other killings that this op-ed points out to, and I will also ask Sardar Mengal. There seems to be killings going on by both sides. Has Human Rights Watch witnessed any such thing?
Absolutely. I mean, Human Rights Watch is, I think, perhaps the only international group that has also produced a report about abuses by Baloch nationalists. And certainly, there has been the targeting by Baloch nationalists of settlers in the province, Punjabi speakers, Urdu speakers. And there is certainly a lack of sympathy, certainly no involvement, but a lack of sympathy for the ongoing targeted killing of the Hazara. That is all absolutely correct. And certainly, Baloch nationalists are not free of abuses at their end. But I would emphasize, Aisha, and this is very important, that there is no parity of abuse in Balochistan. The state, particularly the military, the paramilitary, such as the Frontier Corps, and the intelligence agencies are by far the greatest and most egregious abusers in that terrain. So while certainly Baloch nationalists have committed abuses, we seek to hold them to account, and we have certainly urged them to desist from that sort of abuse. The fact is that there is no equality. Also, because of the particular ethnic mosaic that you find in Balochistan, what we were alluding to earlier, the fact that there's a large Pashtun population, the fact that there are these settlers and so on, if this business of targeting various communities does not end, there is a very great possibility, and this is what we fear, of Balochistan slipping into ethnic warfare and an ethnic bloodbath. Now, that would be detrimental for everybody, not least the Baloch. And that is why there needs to be a rights-respecting compact that needs to come into play in that province.
Okay, and let me ask Sardar Mengal to comment on what we just heard from both Christine and Ali, both on what's going on in Balochistan by Baloch nationalists, why, and also that Baloch is probably not the largest population in the province anymore, so why do they claim to basically represent the whole province?
Asha, we never claim that the Balochs are in majority, but it's a fact that Balochs are not in minority also. If you take out the chunk of the Awan Mahajireens or Awan refugees, which have came since 1979, it's there. Nobody can deny their presence in Balochistan. Even your Quetta is full of this Awan citizens. They have all the facilities. They have all the support of the government, but still they call themselves Awan Muhajirs or Awan refugee, and they are in millions. And if you count these Awanis as a Pashtun, obviously then Baloch will be in minority. And if you minus them, then Baloch will be in majority.
That's
I think I'll
there's no evidence to support that claim, sir, with all due respect. There really is no evidence to support that. And obviously that's part of the reason why the census has been delayed yet again is because of this issue. But there really is no evidence to say that the Baloch would be a plurality. And in addition to that, until there's a census, it's not clear how many of those Pashtuns are in fact
Christine,
Afghan
just to make
citizens
it
who have a place to go back to.
Just to make it very clear,
demography has a way of changing things permanently.
Christine, just to make it very clear, you're saying that the Pashtun population of Baloch that you're mentioning is minus all the Afghan refugees that might have settled in Pakistan, that they're indigenous Pashtuns from Pakistan.
Well, there have historically been Pashtuns in Balochistan. I mean, this is one of the things I find very frustrating in the Baloch narrative. I want to go back up to, even the vocabulary that we use to describe the situation is very puzzling to an outsider. So, for example, that the word settler is used for a Punjabi that moves from their home in Karachi or Peshawar or Lahore. And just because the Punjabi has moved to Balochistan, now they're called settlers. As an American, if we were to refer to people from Montana moving to D.C. as settlers, I mean, that's just contrary to this notion of a national project. And the fact that many people in Pakistan refer to themselves and to others in this very peculiar way, I think does attest to some of the fundamental nation building problems that the whole Pakistan project has been beset with from the beginning. But, you know, I would ask analysts as well as journalists to think about, what does it mean to call a Punjabi in Baluchistan a settler? They are a Pakistani citizen moving from one part of Pakistan to another. That's not what a settler is. When we think about settlers, we think about occupation.
It just goes on to show how complicated this issue is. You're right, it's a problem with language. To this day, even people who moved from India are called Mahajir, but you're right, the settler, the settler issue is, just describes how complicated the issue is. But coming back to what Baloch are facing in the province, the first military operation against Baloch was in 48. Since then, there have been 5. The latest one started during the reign of General Pervez Musharraf, which, according to Baloch leaders, is still going on. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Sardar Akhtar Mengal. What would it take at this point for you to sit down on the table with the Pakistani government, and what can they offer you that would make you happy or satisfied?
Aisha, it's not the first time that the operation, as you said, it's the 5th military operation. After each operation, we have sat with them, we have dialogue with them. The outcome was 0. And the first insurgency which took place in 1948, Agha Abdul Karim, who was the guerrilla commander of that time, he came down from the mountains. They offered him the negotiation. He sat with him in the negotiation table, and they sentenced him for 10 years plus 8 years in prison. Second time was during 1962, Ayub Khan's time, when again against the one unit this started. Nawab Noruz Khan, along with his fellow people, he went to the mountains to resist. They asked him to come back, and when he came back, he was sentenced for life imprisonment. His all sons and brothers was sentenced for the death. And we have tried all the means. Now what we want, we are ready to sit with them, but with some guarantors. Who will be the guarantor that it won't happen again and again?
Who do you want as a guarantor?
Well, it's not the first time it's happened. It's happened all over the world, like United Nations.
Okay, thank you. Now, before I come to who can be a guarantor, I want to go to some other Facebook comments. We have lots of them. We may not be able to get through all of them, but we'll put some of them up on screen as we are talking. Here's a comment from Shaista Yamin, who says, the issue is their sovereignty, their say, their freedom of expression, their participation, their rights, which are never respected. They are never heard. Even media is not putting their concerns across properly. Now, coming back to our discussion, Christine, you just heard Sardar Mengal. They're not willing to sit down with Pakistan without a guarantor. They have historical reasons, they say. Who might be able to be a guarantor, and would Pakistan, do you think, accept it?
Aisha, if I may come in here.
Is a non-Pakistani,
yes, Ali, I'll come to you in a minute.
No opinion in this that's relevant.
Okay, and Ali, you want to say something?
Yes, I want to say something. I mean, I would like to say that I do agree broadly with Sardar Mengal's historical narrative, which is that basically the crisis between the Baloch and the Pakistani state is essentially a crisis of credibility. Historically, the Pakistani militarized, centralized state has always treated Baloch leadership with brutality and contempt, and there have been repeated rapprochements, and they have collapsed in the face of, well, more of the same from the Pakistani state. Now, that is absolutely correct. It is quite interesting that just day before yesterday, I think it was, General Kiani, the Pakistani army chief, said that any solution is acceptable in Balochistan that occurs within the confines of the Pakistani constitution. And okay, that would be a good beginning point, but the point is that General Kiani and the Pakistani military have to understand that the Pakistani constitution does not allow for disappearances, torture, illegal detentions, and targeted killings, extrajudicial killings of the Baloch. So in order to earn credibility, I think that there is room still for perhaps for greater flexibility from Sardar Mengal if the Pakistani authorities engaged in proactive confidence-building measures. And the confidence-building measures are very straightforward. Stop killing, torturing, and abusing the Baloch. Return the disappeared, at least account for the disappeared. These are the beginnings, these are the confidence-building measures that are required. And I am sorry to say that as of now, there is a lot of rhetoric, but that is not really in evidence. I think that the day it is in evidence, the dynamic will begin to change.
Okay, now
actually, can I augment Ali's point there?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Ali really hit the nail on the head. In some sense, what's happening in Baluchistan, I think, is symptomatic of the larger malaise of the Pakistani state, and that is that there really is no constitutionalism. There is a constitution, but there's no adherence to it. There are no rule of law that binds the deep state and its apparatus, like the ISI, military intelligence, and the army. It basically does whatever it wants to do. Whether we're talking about mass graves in Swat or whether we're talking about the disappearances in Baluchistan, Pakistan is going to continue to confront these challenges until it figures out how to make this experiment in constitutionalism work for it.
Thank you, Christine. Now, Sardar Mengal, we have a lot of Facebook comments that also suggest that the Sardari system may be a problem. A lot of people think that the Sardars in Balochistan don't want their population to get educated, that they're unemployed because they don't have proper training and education. What would you say to that?
Asha, for that, again, you have to go for the, have eye on the history. The first resolution was passed in the provincial government or the provincial assembly. That was in 1973 against to abortion of the Sardari system. And that government was my father's government during 1973 to 1974. And let me clear another thing. It's now, as you know, that during Musharraf tenure, he used to say there are only 3 Sardars. The rest of the Sardars are with him. Again, today, it's the same propaganda. They say only 3 Sardars are against the Pakistan and the rest of the Sardars are with them. Why is the Baluchistan still underdeveloped? Why Baluchistan is kept from its political rights? Why Baluchistan is kept behind its economical rights? So all the Sardars are there, and there were those Sardars, I think they have lost their memory of what, there were those Sardars that took advantage of them, and with their signature, they have asked them to merge Baluchistan into Pakistan in 1948.
So basically, you're suggesting that if a lot of Sardars are with the government or were with the government with Musharraf, why wasn't there development in those areas? Ali, I don't know if that's an area you guys go into, but do you have any idea why there's really no development and the per capita income in Balochistan is really below the rest of the country? Ali, can you hear me?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could you repeat the question, please?
I was wondering if this is something that you and your organization look at. What are the causes of lack of development in Balochistan, and why is the population so poor? The per capita income of Balochistan is really below the average income in the country.
Well, you know, Asha, it's a very simple and straightforward correlation. Development indicators are directly related to actually the presence of the state in any given territory. And in Pakistan, the state is present more in some areas and less in others. And the fact is that the Pakistani state is not present in Balochistan for the most part. Now, while I understand that this is, one of the things that is said repeatedly, oh, the Sardars impede development in Baloch districts, they do not allow it. And surely some of the onus lies with the state as well.
With the Sardars.
Which has, 65 years,
Ali, thank you so much. There was no way we could do justice to this topic that's so complicated in half an hour, but we will come back to it. Sardar Mengal, we would love to have you back again. We will go into more specifics, but the time's up for today. Thank you to my guests, Ali Dayan Hassan, Christine Fair, and Sardar Akhtar Mengal, and thank you for watching us. On behalf of the Access Point team, goodbye and good night.